The date is December 11th, 2022. Many of the largest Civ 6 content creators have been invited to participate in a multiplayer free-for-all show match for charity as part of the Civ Give event. Most of these players have thousands of hours of Civ 6 experience, but unbeknownst to the event organizers and most of the viewers, there's a bit of a problem with this lineup. Only one of these content creators is experienced in the multiplayer meta, the French streamer Liege. The game begins, and his spawn is the worst in the entire lobby. There's hardly any hills, few resources, and no fresh water. By all accounts, his Civ ought to be dead on arrival. However, by turn 50, Liege is already leading the pack, and by turn 90, it's like he's not even playing the same game anymore. All of the players in this lobby have easily smoked the AI on the highest difficulty, Deity, many times before. So why can't they keep up with Liege? What makes competitive Civ 6 players so much stronger than their contemporaries? While part of it is simply having more experience playing on the online game speed and dealing with the stress of multiplayer, that doesn't explain dominance on this level. The fact of the matter is, the multiplayer meta for Civ 6 is simply far more refined than anything that's necessary to beat even the strongest AI in the game. While Liege is actually a top competitive player, even a casual multiplayer regular would have been able to destroy this lobby given an average spawn. In this video, we'll be examining the underlying theory behind the meta strategies employed by multiplayer Civ 6 players that have, until now, largely been passed around only by word of mouth. Just a heads up before we begin, we'll be assuming the use of the Better Balanced Game and Better Balanced Map mods for the sake of this guide. While these weren't used in the Civ Give out of respect for all of the single-player content creators' unfamiliarity with them, these mods are used virtually everywhere in multiplayer Civ 6, from high-level competition to casual public lobbies. Not only do they greatly reduce the amount of variance and luck in the game by balancing spawn locations and resource distributions, they also greatly increase the amount of strategic diversity in the meta by nerfing overbearing civs and strategies while buffing those that underperform in the base game. Now, let's move on to the actual theory. The goal of this guide isn't to give you a step-by-step build order to mindlessly copy, it's to give you a robust understanding of how and why the meta of multiplayer Civ 6 works, and to key you into how top players like Liege understand the game completely differently from those who just play against deity AI like Potato McWhiskey. The first thing to understand is that the game can essentially be broken down into three phases. The early game, which is focused on settling new cities, growing their populations, and generally maximizing your empire's total production. The mid-game, which is focused on rapidly growing your science, building out a ton of districts in your existing cities, and generally trying to get ahead of everyone else. And the late game, where players begin to run out of generalized infrastructure to produce, and the only thing left to pursue is victory conditions and war. We'll be starting off, of course, by examining the early game. In this phase of the game, all that matters is settling a ton of cities, growing those cities, and building at least one of these three economic districts in nearly all of your cities as their first district. Food and production are valued above all else here, and as gold and faith can be used to serve essentially the same function as production under the right conditions, they can also be prioritized to varying degrees depending on the build. Economic districts provide these stats for us. Not just faith and gold, mind you, but food and production as well. For instance, holy sites can be used in conjunction with the Monumentality Golden Age dedication to turn faith into civilian units, essentially allowing us to use faith in place of production. Furthermore, if the natural tile yields of our land are low on food, the belief "feed the world" can be chosen when founding a religion to fix that. However, and this is especially true in the Better Balanced Game mod, non-religious civs prefer to ignore holy sites entirely in favor of either harbors or commercial hubs. Just like how holy sites don't just grant faith, commercial hubs and harbors don't just grant gold. You see, lighthouses and markets both provide +1 trade route capacity, and by doing a little bit of min-maxing, it's possible to get very significant food and production yields on internal trade routes early on. Therefore, these districts are ideal for growing our empire very quickly, giving us high population cities and good production. Hopefully, this is making sense so far. What comes as a surprise to most players dipping their toes into multiplayer for the first time, however, is the knowledge that science is actually fairly unimportant in the early game. This runs counter to what many players may have come to expect from playing other strategy games. After all, having a ton of science is critical for every victory condition, as well as being necessary to get an advanced enough military to defend oneself. So, why do top players neglect science development in the early game? Well, why is science usually prioritized early on in other similar strategy games? Generally, it's because there's a positive feedback loop between their equivalents of science and production. Getting more science gives you technologies that boost your production, and getting more production lets you build more things that grant science. Positive feedback. In Civ 6, however, the reality is almost the exact opposite. You see, just beyond the early classical era, there's a large drought of useful technologies for growing your empire's food and production. Worse, there's the matter of district cost scaling. You see, in Civ 6, the cost of districts isn't stagnant. The production required to construct a new district scales with the number of technologies and civics we've completed. What this means is that the cost of constructing new districts stays cheap for longer if we have lower science, and this is the first key insight that competitive players use to get ahead. Fun fact, it's actually possible to use the Shift-Enter hotkey to force end your turn without selecting a technology. Doing so doesn't actually waste any science. Any science you generate which doesn't get spent immediately is stored for later use in a process known as science overflow, and will automatically be spent the next time you select a technology that's too expensive to complete in one turn without it. What this means is that the optimal strategy in the early game is to unlock your key early districts and tile improvements, and then force end your turn without researching anything at all for the next 20 turns in order to keep your districts as cheap as possible. Does that sound completely stupid to you? Well, you're not alone, because the competitive community thought so too. That's why the multiplayer helper mod automatically selects a technology to research at the end of the turn if the player fails to do so. Being forced to research something every turn prevents this exploit, and frankly makes the game more fun and accessible. If you're playing without mods, though, force ending your turn without researching anything after you've unlocked your core districts is still the optimal strategy. Now, let's get back on topic. A common noob trap is to place a ton of campuses early on and focus on getting a lot of science quickly. However, this doesn't increase your production or grow your empire, and as you finish more techs, you only cause districts to become more expensive, making it harder and harder to develop new cities. Building a library in Civ 6 is essentially spending production on something that makes development harder. That's not what we want in the early game. Okay, one last point about the early game before we move on to talking about the mid game. In the early game, committing to a war never really pays off and should only be done as a last resort. Even if we manage to win the war and conquer someone, so long as they put up a decent defense and slow us down a bit, the rewards will never outweigh the costs. Consequently, we'll fall behind in the long run. Therefore, we should avoid war entirely, at least until we get to the mid game. So, what is the mid-game in Civ 6? As it turns out, it's the phase of the game where we're finally ready to start building out our science. We've settled plenty of cities, we have plenty of economic districts that we built cheaply by keeping our science low so far, and our food and production needs are largely taken care of. If our science blows up now, we'll be able to handle the rising production costs of constructing new districts. How do we know when the early game ends and the mid game begins, though? That's easy. It's when we unlock the Feudalism Civic. This civic represents the single most critical power spike in the entire game, as it grants access to the Serfdom Policy card. This card grants each new builder 2 additional build charges. This seems pretty good on the face of it. Builders start with 3 charges, so this results in a 66% increase in production efficiency on them. However, in reality, a mere 66% increase is a severe underestimation of the production efficiency provided by this policy card. If the unintuitive mechanic required to understand the early game was district cost scaling, The unintuitive mechanic required to understand the mid-game is builder cost scaling. Builders are, of course, essential in Civ 6. Alongside districts, builders form the backbone of infrastructural development. While the way district cost scaling works incentivizes building as many districts as we could in the early game on account of them being cheaper with fewer techs and civics completed, the same is not true for builders. In Civ 6, the cost of a builder starts at a flat 25 production on online speed, but each successive builder produced increases the cost of the next one by 2. This has huge ramifications on the efficacy of the serfdom policy card and the extra build charges it grants. Stick with me here. Say we want to get our hands on 90 build charges for our empire. Without serfdom, this requires 30 builders with 3 charges each. With serfdom, this requires 18 builders, which will all have 5 charges each. At first glance, only having to produce 18 builders instead of 30 seems like a 66% increase in production efficiency. And if all of the builders cost the same production, this would be true. However, in reality, each successive builder is more expensive than the last due to how builders scale. The cost of producing n builders is equal to 25n plus the sum of the series 2n from 1 to n. For 18 builders, that's 792 production. For 30 builders, that's 1700 production. That's right, using the serfdom policy card to get our hands on 90 build charges didn't result in a 66% increase in production efficiency. It resulted in a 114% increase in production efficiency. As a result, the meta has evolved such that, in virtually every game, every civ wants to reach the feudalism civic as quickly as possible, put in the serfdom policy card, and instantly produce a large wave of builders across their empire. What's key to remember, however, is that this wave of builders we produce will be cheaper the fewer we've made so far. As a result, strong Civ players will exercise restraint in the number of builders they produce early on. It's always still good to make a few of them early to build some key tile improvements, but we avoid going overboard and improving everything until we get to the serfdom card. Earlier, we stated that the mid-game starts upon reaching the feudalism civic, but that's not entirely true. In reality, transitioning between the early game to the mid-game is a process that begins with unlocking feudalism and takes a few turns. It's not that we hit feudalism and then immediately stop producing settlers and economic districts. It's that we hit feudalism, we produce our wave of 5-charge builders, and then we use the bursts of production granted by chopping features and resources to finish up the tail end of our early game development, building out all of our markets and traders in a couple of turns. Afterwards, as all of our cities finish these early game priorities, they start to transition into the mid-game priorities of maximizing science and culture. We talked a lot in the early game section about tempering our science yield to keep our districts cheaper. However, even though districts also have their cost scale based on civics, we said nothing about tempering our culture output. Now that we understand the power of feudalism, it should start to become clear why. The more culture we have, the faster we can reach feudalism and get our builders going. Just make sure to avoid grabbing any unnecessary civics along the way in order to avoid increasing the cost of districts. So really, the early game is about 3 things: food, production, and culture. In online speed games, a stat line of 15 science and 40 culture on turn 40 is great. A stat line of 40 science and 15 culture, however, is the sure sign of a novice. Believe it or not, these monument thingamajigs that give 2 culture each are actually kind of good. Okay, so to recap the mid-game, we rush feudalism, pump out a ton of builders with the serfdom policy card, and chop most of our woods and bonus resources for food and production. Adding to this, we also want to put mines on all of our hills and grab the apprenticeship technology for the passive +1 production it grants on all mines. You can see how quickly we snowball when this is done correctly. On turn 45, we're sitting at roughly 40 science and 45 culture. 10 turns later, on turn 55, our stats have more than doubled to over 100 of each as we finished up the remainder of our early game development and started building out our campuses. Over the next 10 turns, we pump out universities and workshops, claim some great people, and before you know it, our science has nearly tripled to a whopping 280 by turn 65. As crazy as it sounds, this sort of explosive growth is actually the norm in multiplayer Civ 6. Recall how, earlier in the video, we mentioned that wars never really pay off in the early game. Well, the early game is long behind us, and wars are becoming far more lucrative. Once players get their wave of 5-charge feudalism builders out and start improving all of their land and chopping out a ton of districts, they start becoming viable targets for conquest. The main reasons for this? There are two. First, conquering developed cities is simply more rewarding than conquering undeveloped cities. If the land's already improved, it saves us the trouble of making builders to improve it ourselves. Not having to improve the land ourselves is especially valuable when you take into account that each successive builder we produce is more expensive than the last. The second reason that wars become better after mid-game development is the value of pillaging. You see, pillaging a tile improvement or district doesn't remove it and gives a ton of immediate yields. Think of pillaging in the same way as chopping. Yields now are almost always better than yields later. Furthermore, the cost of repairing pillaged improvements and districts after conquering a city is extremely cheap, such that thoroughly pillaging land during conquest is always preferred. If we launch an attack too early into the game, there won't be enough pillageable tiles to recoup the cost of producing our military. Okay, so we've covered the early game and the mid game, so what about the late game? When does it begin, and how does it differ from the mid game? Really, the late game is defined by a shifting of priorities away from generic empire development and towards actual win conditions. As religious victory and diplomatic victory are both very easy to prevent in multiplayer free-for-all games, we largely just ignore them. This means we have a choice between min-maxing our empire to produce space projects for science victory, or maximizing our tourism for culture victory. However, we won't always be in a position where we stand a chance of being the first to an actual victory condition. In fact, most late games only have 2 to 3 players who are actually competitive for first. So, what do? Well, we could try teaming up with the other players to take down those in the lead, but teaming up like that kind of defeats the point of a competitive free-for-all setting. We could also just leave the game and let the handful of players who can still win duke it out alone, but that comes with its own set of problems. Mainly, it's just that the AI is really bad at defending themselves. If everyone who couldn't win just left the game as soon as the late game rolled around, the optimal strategy for the remaining players would just be to eat up all of the AI civilizations, which isn't particularly fun or interactive. This is the dilemma that the multiplayer Civ 6 free-for-all community faced at first. How do we motivate players to stick around and keep the late game interesting when they don't have any actual win condition? Fortunately, the largest Civ 6 multiplayer community in the world, CPL, came up with a solution. Their Discord server has a skill-based ranking system and a leaderboard, and every time a game is reported, each player gains and loses points based on their placement. That way, even if you don't win the whole thing, there's still an incentive to keep playing in order to achieve a higher placement. This has given birth to the concept of playing for second. If a player reaches the start of the late game and realizes that they can't win a space race and can't achieve a culture victory, they're incentivized to pivot into a play for second strategy. While first place just goes to whoever wins, all of the rankings past that are simply determined by who has the highest score, indicated by this number on the ribbons at the top of the screen. The best way to inflate your score is to have as many cities and as many citizens as possible. And the best way by far to do that is by conquering other civs. Therefore, the late game in Civ 6 free-for-all consists of a handful of players competing for victory conditions while carefully ensuring they're safe from the rest of the lobby, all of whom rapidly militarize and try to kill whoever they can to get a higher score. While games sometimes go all the way to a victory screen, this is actually fairly rare. Generally, once everyone in the lobby is satisfied with their positions, the game will be conceded by a vote. So, to summarize the basic theory behind the multiplayer Civ 6 meta, you have the early game development period based around rapid growth, high production, and placing economic districts. Then, you have the mid-game, the start of which is indicated by unlocking the feudalism civic and creating a wave of 5-charge builders across your empire. During the mid-game, players devote themselves to maximizing their science and culture to secure a lead in the tech and civics tree. Lastly, you have the late game, where players have largely finished developing their empires, and the only thing left to do is to directly compete, either by pursuing win conditions or simply militarizing and conquering other players for a higher score. This is just the beginning of your journey through multiplayer Civ 6. You'll notice that we didn't really go into many specifics regarding build orders in this video. When to build what, which governors to choose, how to actually achieve a victory, and if those things interest you, you're in luck. My YouTube channel is brimming with much more specific, detailed guides on various Civ 6 multiplayer strategies. Feel free to peruse them at your leisure. And if you ever decide you want to try your hand at multiplayer Civ 6, consider joining CPL. As the largest multiplayer Civ 6 community, it's always looking for new players to join. If the prospect of playing with the likes of me scares you, you'll be happy to learn that there's plenty of novice-only lobbies being organized every day, creating the perfect environment to dip your toes in. You can find CPL on their website, cpl.gg, and join their Discord server at discord.gg/cpl. Thanks for watching to the end. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and let me know in the comments if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see me cover next. Herson, signing out.